Welcome, everyone, to the Q&A session for our upcoming course titled Spiritual Allyship. In this 5-week journey, you will get to participate in powerful processes to explore privilege, racial biases, and real-time actions that reflect an expanding, inclusive mindset. My name is Dereca, and it is my pleasure to be hosting this hour-long Q&A call for the Shift Network, where we will explore the teachings of Dereca Blackmon and address questions about spiritual allyship, which begins next Thursday, August 27th. Later, I will explain how you can participate in this course, even if you can't attend the live sessions. But first, I am so excited to introduce our very special guest. Dereca Blackmon, co-founder and CEO of Inclusion Design Group, is a passionate speaker, facilitator, and national expert on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. For over 25 years, she has consulted with a wide variety of corporate, educational, nonprofit, and community-based groups to facilitate uncommon conversations on issues of race, gender, class, and social justice. Her experiential training models cut through diversity fatigue and allow participants to engage in deep, authentic, and meaningful dialogues. In just a few moments, we are going to open up for your questions. But first, let me welcome Dereca, who will begin our call by leading us in an opening prayer. Welcome, Dereca.
Thank you so much, Nadira. It's so great to be here with you and, of course, all of my family at the Shift Network. It's just a wonderful time for us to be reflecting deeply on these issues. So why don't we start that reflection with a little bit of centering? And so just right where you are, if you're willing, just take a moment to go within. I just want to acknowledge all of the ways that we name the Most High Divine Presence. Whether we call it God, Spirit, love, nature, Allah, Buddha, however we call upon it, let us call upon it now. And allow ourselves to recognize our oneness with this divine energy, this divine creation. It is the truth about who and whose we are. And so I just declare that our time together in this course, in this Q&A session, in this life is whole, perfect, and complete. That everything about the way we show up together furthers the cause of justice, of allyship, of love, of peace, of harmony in our country, in our world, wherever we are, that divine presence is. And so I just give thanks for each and every person who showed up here today, curious, humble, willing, ready, for all of the questions, all of the answers, and all of the places we stay in the question as we explore these important concepts. And I do the most important thing I can. I let go. I let go of my own ideas, my own beliefs, my own attachments, and allow this divine spirit to flow through me, as me. And so it is. Amen. Ashe.
And so it is. Thank you. For everyone who is listening, we want to devote as much of our time together as possible to your questions. So if at any time during this call you want to learn more about this upcoming course, please visit spiritualallyship.com to see the full description. And if you have questions for our customer service department, you can contact the customer support team directly at support.theshiftnetwork.com. And now let's dive into questions. If you have a question for Dereca and you haven't already, please offer them. I'm happy to read them. Please also be aware that we have quite a few questions coming in, so we may not have time to get to everyone's inquiry. The first question that I am going to offer, we've got some really rich ones actually, is from Donna, who says, how can one support the Black Lives Matter movement, but still disapprove of the destructive property damage without hurting feelings?
Wow, what a powerful, powerful question. Thank you so much, Donna. A couple of principles I want to start with, which is to say that no one of us can speak for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think one of the misconceptions is that it's a codified, unified movement. Like if we were to talk about the women's movement, we know that that means different things to different people. or even, as we talked about, whether it was Time's Up or Me Too, everyone interpreted those things differently. So no one person, even the founders of the hashtag, no one can speak for Black Lives Matter as a whole. So whatever I give as an answer, it's not as a spokesperson for the movement. So I want to just clarify that. I also think that this idea of honoring and having a different idea about something is super important. I think our language is really important. So as we talk about constructs like disapprove or hurting feelings, I think we have to explore a little bit more about what we need. And so I think we can disagree with something without having to disapprove of it. And so that allows for people to have the space for their own expression. And to recognize that on the pathway to justice, there are many, many different ideas. I think it was Dr. King who said riots are the voices of the unheard. And so we can have really strong feelings and disagree with people. But I think it's important that if we're wanting to create support for people, that we try to suspend a little bit of our judgment. Because it's not really just about hurting people's feelings. It's really about acknowledging the right of people to self-determine what feels right for them as an expression. Now, that's a hard thing to do because we certainly have to draw some lines and say, this is not okay with me. But I think this is a fragile conversation about injustice and oppression and what is the right way to challenge that. And I'm more inclined to stay away from right and wrong and actually be humble and curious about why people see different strategies as important.
Thank you very much. This question is for someone diving right in, considering the title of the course. Michael says, what is spiritual allyship?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Michael. I think it's an important question. I will say that my intention for the course is that we are a learning community together. And so part of what we'll do is explore that. Because like everything else, spiritual allyship means different things to different people. There are some people in our world today who don't like the term allyship. They want accomplices or co-conspirators, I've even heard. I don't really prefer those terms for myself, but I think it's a very personal journey to be an ally. And so we'll certainly talk about what some of the conversations and norms and definitions are, but I'm not really prescriptive as a person. So I can tell you what it means to me. It means having a level of accountability to a community and its organizations, its leadership, its, mass grassroots organizing to support their self-identification and align as much as possible with opportunities to create justice. So that's what it means to me. The spiritual component is about really being mindful of what it is that we are working for, not just what we're working against. My friend Van Jones likes to say, Dr. King had a dream, not just a complaint. So he wasn't just trying to get off the back of the bus. He wanted something that was much more revolutionary than that. He wanted to see Black children and white children holding hands. And that was a much bolder, harder idea. So I think some of where we have some challenges right now is what level, and we'll talk a lot about this in the course, what level of participation do I want? So I think that's why it's a really personal answer. And we want each person to walk away having an understanding of what it means for them.
Thank you. And I also just want to celebrate the variety of the questions that are coming in from people of very clearly different backgrounds. This next one is from Kay, who says, as a Black woman, I am drained and too often have been disappointed by whites claiming to be allies. My experience includes dealing with a lot of white arrogance. At this point, it feels simpler to withdraw than to deal with the stresses of the behavior of far too many white people who need to be applauded for the smallest improvements 400 years after Africans were brought to these shores against their will. How do I get the energy to be willing to continue to engage?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I think this is a really, really important question for those of us who have been marginalized by systems and institutions of oppression. Now is a time for rigorous self-care. It is so, so, so important that we turn our focus within right now and ask ourselves the deeper spiritual, nurturing, self-care, self-love kinds of questions about what do I need to sustain myself in this moment? Sometimes it is to move away from some of the more difficult, toxic conversations. I always say that people who spend more time in the danger zone of life need more time in the comfort zone. And I think sometimes we take on social media for friends, family, employers who are what I call the toughest nuts to crack. When there's so much more low-hanging fruit of people around us who either already get it or are really working hard to get it, who have a level of humility and want to support leadership of Black people in this country or other marginalized people. So I would say for me, I know that there are times where I have to, step away a little bit and move into my own self-care and reflection space. I have to play music and dance and meditate and pray and laugh and, just have other things going on in my life because it really is exhausting. I also think we shouldn't do this work alone. It's really, really important to build community so that you're not alone having these conversations. Join a space where people are having them collectively, where you won't feel like I'm the only one who gets this. That can also be really valuable, as well as, like I said, taking a break from places where you're the only one who is saying what you have to say. I think in the course, I'm really focused on giving people new frameworks and new ideas to reconsider the authority with which they are attached to certain rights and wrongs. So I think part of what marginalized people get when they sit alongside people who are seeking to be allies is they get an opportunity to find language that they can use in some of their conversations. But I will say, the course is probably not for everyone. If you've already been exhausted, the space in which I, as an educator, love to kind of meet people where they are and hold their hands along the journey and support them in grappling with their own ideas and understandings it may feel like too much and too much labor. And so I really want to honor that this might be the time to read Resmaa Menachen's book, Grandmother's Hands, around what are some of the impacts on me and the trauma in my spirit and my body around these things, and how can I take care of myself? So I want to honor that there's an opportunity to be in community in this course with people and find new language to talk about some of these issues. And I also want to honor that this isn't the right time for everyone to be in a room where people, sometimes for the first time, are grappling with what it means to be an ally.
Thank you very much. Amanda says, do you consider racial injustices the same as cultural injustices? And if not, please explain.
Wow. So this is interesting because one of the things that I really think is important for us to teach is that context, nuance is everything. So unless I really actually know what you mean by racial injustice and cultural injustice, it's sort of a disservice for me to answer the question. Just to, be in communion with what we're doing here today, I'll take a stab at what I think it might mean. But in general, that's not how we want to be, especially in these contentious issues. If we just took the time sometimes to get clarity with people on what they mean by a thing, I think often we'll find that we're more aligned with their ideas than we thought. Let's see. Race is culture. Right? Race is also a construct. It's also an artificial construct, and we know all of those things. But for me, I don't have a real separate thing from race and culture for me. I do think that there are some people who, especially globally, don't refer to race in the same way that we do in the West. It's not that construct. I think that colorism and issues of color are still issues globally all over the world. Skin whitening is a $4 billion industry for a reason. It's because that phenomenon of anti-Blackness and that social hierarchy around skin color really does exist in almost every society. If you look at beauty standards and images, you'll see a lot about that. But unfortunately, I feel like I don't want to do the question injustice without some more nuance of what cultural justice means. But I do think we need to be unapologetic about talking about racial justice specifically.
Thank you. This next question is from Eric, and it's a little bit provocative. He says, I had a recent falling out with a dear friend because I sang a song from NPR Tiny Desk that I liked very much to her. It contained the N-word. A Black man sang the song, My friend is also Black, I am white. I've never felt such a racial divide as when she essentially said, in what world did I think it was okay to say that word to her, and cut off communication? If I'm reading a book aloud and the word in appears, am I to omit it or never share it? I'm having trouble relating. This is pretty much the only time I've ever used this word with her, except in this instance of singing along. I would like to recover the friendship, but I'm also offended that our 5+ years of shared trips, many acts of friendship toward each other, are seemingly nullified over this. Please help me understand if you can.
I will do my best with the caveat, of course, that no one can speak for your friend but your friend. But I can tell you where the sting of that word is hard for people to understand. The sting of words is always hard if you haven't heard them in certain contexts. And I try to use other aspects of identity to help people understand with things they could better relate to. I think there are certain words that we recognize why they could be insulting. And so you may want to explore what words for women would you never feel comfortable repeating, even if it were in a book or a song? Are there words that you would say, yeah, I'm not actually going to say the B word or the C word or things like that, even if it's in a song, or I don't even want to repeat a song where something like that is being said. Right. So see if there are any words, whether it's words to refer to Jewish people that have racial slurs, or words to refer to LGBTQ people. Like, if you heard a song, is there a word that you would say, I don't want to sing that song because the word is in there? And I would never share that song with anyone, much less a person who holds that identity, because I get that that would be offensive to that person. So that's one thing, is try to find a parallel of a word you wouldn't say, right? So try to find a parallel, I think, is a first step that helps. Another thing is something that I call cultural humility, which we'll talk about. One of the sessions in the course is specifically on humility. And it is really just this idea of separating intent from impact. I talked a little bit about it earlier in the Q&A, that it's not really it's not really emotionally intelligent to go to judging the way a person feels impacted. Feedback is always a gift. So when someone tells you that was insulting, it was harmful, it was racist, sexist, homophobic, we tend to want to get defensive and say, that's not my intention. But if we can just honor that the emotionally intelligent thing to do is to stay with the impacted person rather than shift the focus to our intention. It's hard to do. We all get defensive. I get defensive when someone says something about some of the privileged identities that I hold. And I'm like, well, that's not fair. That's not what I mean. But if we part of what we want to talk about in terms of being allies is humility. Just stay with the place where you can't imagine the hurt. And so rather than evaluating whether the hurt is appropriate or not, just stay with the humility that I don't know. I don't know why this bothers her so much. I don't know why it bothers them so much, but I care, right? If you spill hot coffee on someone, you don't say, it's not my fault, it was this people back. You shouldn't feel burned because it's not my fault. You say, oh, I'm so sorry. Let me get you a napkin. Are you okay? How can I help you? Not because you're guilty, not because you're wrong, but because you care about the person. And that's that kind of care and humility is a core component of spiritual allyship. So take a deep breath. If the person would be willing, and they may not be willing to hear from you, at some point when you feel like you could give an unqualified apology, right? Unqualified, not you didn't understand, I didn't mean this, I didn't know, but just I'm so sorry that what I said hurt you. And is there anything that I can do to repair the harm? Knowing that one of the answers may be, I'm not talking to you, or I don't hear you, or no, you can't. So those are a couple things. The last thing that I'll say, and this is part of what the course is about, is that this is a time for us to heighten our awareness. And I think that marginalized people are having a higher expectation of awareness because the whole world is talking about this issue of racism right now. I think it's a reasonable thing to expect people to be more sensitive than ever, especially people we're in loving relationships with. So just know that sometimes the standard is higher because we're closer. And if you think about that, like anybody who's had a romantic partner or an intimate partner knows that the closer you are to someone, the more likely you're offended by something they say because your standard is higher. So we'll talk more about these components of allyship in the course, but just try to take a deep breath, not be defensive, stay really humble, and recognize none of us know what is a danger zone experience for someone else.
Thank you so much. And I really hope that Eric is listening and joins the course. I would love to hear an update about how things go there. If you are just joining us, we are here with Dereca Blackmon, learning about her upcoming course, Spiritual Allyship, which begins next Thursday, August 27th. Please log on to spiritualallyship.com for all the details and to register. And this next question is from Bhavani, who says, what do you think about doing this work in race affinity groups?
Interesting. I really love race affinity group conversations. One thing that I did is I was teaching at Stanford University a course called Intergroup Communication, which I took as an undergraduate. It started in 1968 at Stanford after Dr. King was killed as a way for people to come together and talk about the impact of his assassination on them. The course evolved so that it was racial and there were 4 components: race, gender, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. And people broke up into their affinity groups, their own racial groups, came up with anonymous questions for all the other groups. And each group took a turn sitting in the center of the floor and answering anonymous questions from all the other racial groups. Now, when I tell people this happens, they're terrified. Oh my gosh, that must be horrible. By the time I left Stanford this past January, we had over 250 students on the waiting list for that class. And it's because we really do want to talk about these things. We just need structures that feel safe for us to do this, where we can be brave, but also be safe. And that's very intentionally the design of this course. We may not do racial affinity groups because having people do that in this construct is not always easy to do, but it depends on who is involved in the course. But I do actually believe we did some research on the course, and we found that people learned the most when they were the most uncomfortable. We call this phenomenon constructive discomfort. And it's actually been well researched that when people feel uncomfortable, they learn a lot. And those racial affinity groups give us an opportunity to have that in-community conversation, to kind of say the things that might be misinterpreted in other places, and actually get feedback from our peer group before we have intergroup communication.
Thank you very much. And we have a question coming in from Mary, who says, I am 79 and live with my sister, who is 82, and my husband, who is also 82. Do you have any insights into what is the most potent role an elder can play as a spiritual ally at this specific moment in history? And thank you for considering this question.
Oh, you are so very welcome. First of all, I just want to say that I come from a culture where elders are revered. And so thank you so much for just saying yes to what your role might be. With that reference, I think, my grandmother used to say, I didn't get this old being stupid. And so I think that there is often, not always, but often a lot of wisdom that comes with age. And I think sometimes we can be afraid to tell people the hard lessons that we've learned, the difficult things that we've seen. And I think one of the things that can be most disconcerting in the conversations about dismantling racism is the level of denial about whether it's real. And I think it's really hard for people to say, I've seen racist things, and even harder to say I've done racist things. But those who carry a long memory can really actually give testimony to, like, yes, actually, it's as bad as some people have said it is. And this has been going on for generations. But also give testimony to allyship and its history. We'll have a whole session in the course talking about some history of some amazing racial allies who were white and who did some really powerful things, not, as some people say, to give out badges, but to give out context and role models. And so I think our elders have a lot of wisdom and information to share. And also, I think, can do a really good job, a better job than some of us, to communicating with people in their peer group. Because sometimes there's a dissonance between generations. Often there is, right? And there's this way in which having somebody say, wait a minute, now you remember when we were growing up, this is how people were treated, or these are the things people used to say. And you know that those kinds of in-community conversations, again, can be extraordinarily powerful. And we hear from a lot of people that one of their biggest challenges is talking to people from other generations that are older than them, who, don't really get what's happening in the world today. But there are many elders who do get what's happening in the world today, and hearing from them, I think, can be really impactful.
Thank you very much. Sandy says, on the one hand, I believe white Americans should use their privilege to bring about social justice. On the other hand, whites need to not center ourselves in this work. What is the best way to contribute our skills, connections, etc., without falling into white centering or white saviorism?
Oh, this is such a really great question, and such one of the hardest questions, and something I hope we will really grapple with together in the course, is what our vision is for allyship. Because I'm going to tell you, if you're doing allyship for approval, you're not going to get it. Everybody has a different idea right now about what it looks like. And I've seen people who say white people need to stand in the front of a protest, and white people need to stand in the back of the protest, and white people need to do protests that are all white, and white people need to not show up for the protest, but actually be doing these things on policy. And so it can be mind-boggling to sort of look for what is the right answer. And so on our journey together, we're going to help you explore what is the right answer for me and how can I maintain accountability. One of the things that I'll say is aligning yourself with a group of people who you can be accountable to and who you learn from and share information and strategy with can be really helpful, because, like I said, different groups have really different ideas. And so when you do your homework and you find, wow, I really want to be a part of this group or this movement, that kind of accountability to an organizational strategy or a policy strategy or a spiritual community can really help ground you in a way of this feels like the right community that I want to align myself with in terms of strategy. There's no right answer, honestly. And so I do think that people need to leverage power and privilege that they have, access that they have to certain spaces where other marginalized people won't get access. I think people need to leverage some of their different identities where they have power, whether it's the wealth that they have or the education that they have, the nationality that they have, the political cachet. All of those things can be leveraged without necessarily having to center. And the last thing that I'll say is I really do, someone just asked about racial affinity groups. I really do think that there's some real power to be had in educating each other, and white people specifically educating other white people. And I know there's been some backlash on the book White Fragility, but it frustrates me a little bit because I spent so long in this work and there was such an outcry for whites to educate other whites and not have to have people of color always doing that labor. I understand that the critique of that book is multi-leveled, but one of the critiques is that it takes away and diverts attention from people of color who have been saying these ideas for years. And perhaps that's true, but I do think that there is a specific call to action that we have asked for white allies to step forward in the work of educating other whites where people of color may not always have access. So it's a tricky landscape. I can just say that as an ally to people in the transgender community, I have experienced so much the pushback on strategies that I've tried as an ally. So many. And I apologize today, I didn't. I usually introduce myself and say, I'm Dereca Blackmon, and I use she and they pronouns. And in the class, we'll explore some of my experiences with having all kinds of different reactions to me even saying that. So just know that allyship is not going to be universally accepted, and it's a very personal journey, but we can create a level of impact and accountability, and let's explore together how to do that.
Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to say to you that I'm appreciating in terms of the questions that are being offered and then your responses is the emphasis on awareness of the personal, but also that it's an opportunity to explore completely shifting the mentality that a lot of us are raised with and maybe haven't challenged or explored before. So I'm excited. And we've got some more excellent questions coming in. But I just wanted to say how much I'm appreciating hearing everything that you have to offer. This next question is from...
To be a part of the conversation. I know I never think I'm the only person with wisdom, and I know firsthand some of your wisdom, and I hope that that's part of what we're always going to do in the class is know that we are collective and everybody can learn from everybody. So I just want to offer that if you want to chime in.
Absolutely. But I'm also just enjoying receiving your wisdom here because I'm always still learning as well. This next question is from Dawn, who says, how do I find out, it's very timely given everything that's taking place right now, how do I find out who are the candidates, lawmakers, DAs, and judges in my area who support best practices for social justice?
Whoa, what a big question. I wish, in terms of what allies can do, I wish there was a resource that I could point you to and say, these folks can help you determine that. I know when it comes time and we're closer to election, it's always really helpful when we have these voter guides. And we talked about having yourself aligned with people who share similar views, perspectives, and values. Sometimes you'll see one of those people and they'll put out a voter guide and you'll be like, great, I need someone who I can trust, who can help me sort of get through who those people are. So I will just say this is a huge void and opportunity for anybody who's trying to figure out what can they contribute is, this ability to sort of to look at the record of our leaders and be able to talk to it and summarize it. I do read a lot of perspectives that people give around our officials and a lot of conflicting information to try to intentionally pursue conflicting opinions so that I can try to find the nuance and the value for me. Also, I think the harder thing, or maybe the first step, maybe it's not harder, is to figure out what are those best practices that you want your values to be aligned to, right? Because, we might talk about peace as a value that we hold. And then is our standard that anyone who has voted for any war is not a candidate that we would support, right? We could hold that as our standard for what supporting peace means to us. Or we could talk about just and unjust wars and say, okay, I think this action was justified and this action was not. Or we could talk about, safety some people are feel very firmly that having defense budgets and police budgets and things like this are part of creating peace. Right. So you can see that those are three radically different ideas about how peace is created. So I think in part of what my approach is as we do this work is so much of this is going to be internal work. What do I mean? What are my values? And what are the nuances of how I expect people I'm going to align with my values? So I think that's a really fascinating, great question. If anybody's looking for something to take on as an ally, I think this would be a wonderful, wonderful thing we could create as a service. It's just similar to how we have voter guides or endorsement slates is really being able to take a look at people in our local government and have some place where we can look at their records. So some of our journalists do a great job of this, but it'd be interesting to see how we could do that for this issue.
Thank you very much. And we have a few different questions that are in a similar vein from people who are interested in the course who are either in the UK or in Europe. And so they're wondering about whether or not they can make use of the recordings. That's something we absolutely support. But someone else has asked a question about the possibility of getting together in groups that are based on their location in order to have the conversations and discussions. So I wanted to offer that question to you and then see if there are any suggestions you would have, given the information that you've already shared about people making sure that they're being uncomfortable so that they are continuing to grow. And also what you said in response to the racial affinity groups.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. This is my first time teaching with Shift, and I do training globally. So last year was in Dublin, Ireland, and also in Singapore. Regularly work with both Asia and Europe and Latin America. So I really want for anyone from any region to be able to take and benefit from this course. So I'm open to figuring out how we make that happen. Certainly, there are ways for people to hold conversations and work on these things independently. I mean, that's honestly what breakout groups are, and we'll have those in the course. So, yeah, I think there's some practical possibilities for breakout groups or discussions on different time zones. Logistically, I can't promise that because I'm not really sure as my first time of how this will all work. But I will say that I'm excited by the question and that this is a global issue, and global education and exploration of spiritual allyship is really important and valuable to me. So I'll do my very best.
Thank you very much. And this next question is from someone who did not share their name, but they said, you talked about white privilege. That makes me feel like a terrible person, even though I didn't know I was being privileged by something as seemingly ordinary and common as a decent public school education. But must we feel bad because we were the recipient of some kind of privilege, or is our energy better spent ensuring that everyone has access to the same privilege, at which point there won't be any more privilege? For instance, if everyone had equal access to housing options and whites didn't have privileged access to white-only areas, a lot of our segregation problems today might have been avoided. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a big question and an excellent one. We will for sure discuss the ouch of the term privilege. This is something I think it takes some time for us to get into, for us to have the nuance, for us to honor the fact that it hurts to be told that we're privileged. And I think part of the reason is because we've historically associated privilege with wealth, and also there's been this negative connotation of almost kind of laziness and so, or unworthiness. And so there you'll hear people say, I didn't have privilege. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. But that's often because people are comparing apples to oranges. If two people are born low income, but one has the privilege of a white identity, we all know that, or at least in the places that I've lived, that you can have a low income community where there are two sides of the track. And there is absolutely a difference when you walk into a store, whether people know phenotypically that you're a person of color or you're white, there's a difference. And those differences are well documented in jobs and housing and medicine and all kinds in academia. So there's tons of, in the court system, there's tons of research, which is pretty much at this point indisputable on those differences. But I like this idea that if we focus on dismantling the impacts, then we could ultimately, our goal would be to dismantle the privilege. The thing is, you cannot heal what you cannot face. So by saying we are offended by the thing we're trying to dismantle, it creates this lack of confidence in our real commitment to dismantling it. So if we say, I'm offended when you say there's injustice, well, then it's hard to believe that you're going to do a great job of dismantling that injustice. And privilege is not something to, that we're asking people to feel guilty or ashamed about. It's something that's important for people to acknowledge. And I think in the way you structured the question, you've already acknowledged it. You're saying that there was advantages that people had for housing. And I think that's all people are really saying. There's advantages, hidden and not so hidden advantages that have been happening for hundreds of years. And so if we can all be a little bit less sensitive and just say, yep, those advantages are real, whether we call them privilege or we call them advantage or we call them discrimination or we call them whatever we call them, I think acknowledging them, let's get under the words and see what do people mean when they say privilege, right? Because I believe we all have a set of different privileges. I went to Stanford. That's an educational privilege, right? I am a Black queer woman. And so, there's some privileges in that. I mean, some marginalization identities. I'm a light-skinned woman. That's a privilege. I live in the United States. I speak English. Those are privileges. And so if we can get under what we think this word means, I want us to spend some time talking about not fighting over the definition, but understanding what is it that people are trying to get us to see. And maybe we can have some alignment there around what people are really saying by asking people to acknowledge their privilege.
Thank you. And Leah says, will you address how guilt and separation plays in the topic of systemic racism and how we can take a more empowered approach?
Absolutely. That's an easy one. We cannot talk about this unless we're able, as I was just saying in the past example, to talk about historical and systemic oppression. We have to talk about that, and we have to be able to name it. We also have to be able to distinguish it from bias or prejudice. And we'll talk very specifically about these words and what are the differences. And so in order to be, I believe education is empowering. So part of the course will be the benefit of the 20 plus years, I'm a lot older than I look, that I've been doing this educational work in classrooms, outside, in corporations, in churches, like all over the place. And so what I've learned, not just from reading and from, academia and all of those things, but what I've learned from people about what they care about what hurts the most, around what is it that people aren't getting? What's the aha moment that helps people understand, oh, this is what people are asking from me. This is what makes a difference. This is where my, as some people would say, blind spot is, right? So these are things that we're going to explore. And yes, they are for sure going to make us have a more empowered approach.
Beautiful. And because I'm wanting to also make sure that we're balancing as many questions as possible that are coming in, particularly from the POC voices. This next one is from Janet, who says, regarding racism and white supremacy, I agree with Eckhart Tolle that both the victim and perpetrator suffer the consequences of any acts of violence. However, I also agree with Dr. Joy DeGruy and others that each group of people must necessarily do their own healing. My question is this: how do we keep our focus on healing ourselves, people of color, while giving other people who classify themselves as white the space to do their own healing work?
Wow. I think this is a great question. Dr. Joy is definitely a mentor, a friend. And so I love her work on post-traumatic slave syndrome. I think that it's a both and for some of us. I think you cannot do healing work with other people if you don't do your own healing work. It is just extraordinarily difficult. Now, I will say we teach that which we mostly need to learn. So there is no, I'm going to be a perfect healed person and then I can teach. So it's a both and. It's happening at the same time. But I do think, and we talked about this earlier on the call, that there are some people who need to just not be in the business of education right now, because it's a full stop moment for self-care. It is a full stop moment. I tell people I educate for a living because I love to do it, but please don't expect someone with a marginalized identity to educate you just because they hold that identity. We have to do our own work. And so I do think it's super important for people with any marginalized identity to be in a community where they feel most loved, cared for, nurtured, sustained. That work is often separate work. Now, sometimes we can be in multi-racial, multi-leveled, centered, dominant, not dominant communities and still feel some of that support. In fact, some of the healing that happens in those multiracial environments, for instance, can be profound and transformative. And sometimes it can still hurt. In fact, some of the worst things I've ever had have been in communities where I have been in the most spiritual communities, where I have such deep bonds with people. And then when it comes to the issue that most impacts me directly and threatens the very lives of people in my community, when there's this tone deafness, right, for that issue, it's incredibly painful. And this is why it's important for sometimes people to create their own spaces where that's less likely, not totally unlikely, but less likely to happen. And that can be uncomfortable. But I do believe in the right to create your own spaces, to do your own healing work. And I do believe that people who do that work are better suited for cross-cultural communication.
Thank you very much. And we are going to have time for one or two more questions. But before we take those, I want to mention spiritual allyship once more. This is going to be a transformative 5-week journey under Dereca's guidance. And speaking from personal experience, Dereca creates an amazing container and makes space for all participants to powerfully and honestly explore our own individual stories, context, as well as actions we can take to bring about change. The 5-week course takes place on Thursdays at 5 p.m. Pacific, starting Thursday, August 27th. If for any reason you cannot join us live, you won't miss the teachings. You will receive audio and video replays, transcripts, and all course handouts via your course homepage. Also, I would like to remind you that we offer a no-risk, money-back guarantee on our courses, giving you until September 3rd in this case to make sure you absolutely love it, and I know that you will. As an added option, all participants are welcome to connect via a private Facebook community group so that you can stay connected with one another and what emerges as you're making your way through the course. And everyone who registers receives the Spiritual Allyship Bonus Collection, which includes the Song of Prayer, a video libation and prayer and dialogue with Dereca and Jen Johns, the Soundtrack for Spiritual Revolution, a video dialogue with Dereca and Reverend Sekou, Meditation Practices for Dismantling Racism, which is a video dialogue and meditation practice with Dereca and Ravi Spice Reddy, Meditation Practices for Dismantling that's a repeat. And Human First Leadership, a video dialogue with Gainsight CEO, Nick Mehta. And Dereca, can you share what you are most looking forward to in this upcoming course?
I want to say that what I love about the work that I do is what I learned. The more I talk with people who come from very different perspectives, the more I learn about what it is that unites us. And the spiritual and spiritual allyship is about being able to absolutely celebrate and sit in the discomfort and the value of difference, unapologetically to focus on difference. And in that space where we lean into the places where we are sometimes really uncomfortable, something comes to light that allows us to see the connection is leaning into the discomfort and not away from it. So every time we create a container where that happens, the insights that I get from people as they have their aha moments, as they discover what words and concepts like spiritual allyship personally mean to them, I'm so inspired by watching people along that journey, and I'm on that journey with them. So it's the learning community of the people who take this course that I'm most excited about.
Thank you. And so we're going to dive back into as many more questions as we can get through with the time that we have remaining. This question is from Zareen, who actually I think is a really valid one given the discussions that have taken place here. Zareen would like to know whether or not this course will be framed mainly in a US-centric perspective.
Thank you for that. I think that if we're honest with ourselves, we always come from our own perspective. So I'm going to come from the perspective of a Black woman. When I do this work, I'm going to come from all of my privileges and all of my marginalized identities. And yes, there is going to be a privilege of being US based and a context of that will come through. And because I've done work globally, I know how to be intentional about creating an inclusive space and kind of trying to translate some of the concepts and examples for people who come from other regions who still face these issues, but often frame them differently. I talked about race versus colorism in many parts of the world, or how nationality and immigration status impacts places in the world differently than the way we think about race in the US. So we'll definitely acknowledge context, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that my viewpoint or my life experiences, having grown up and lived in the US for all of my life, won't color the way that the course is designed. And it's also designed to reflect the needs of every single person who participates. So I will be very intentional about that.
Wonderful. And our final question, also very timely with everything going on, is from Joao, who says, recently, I have struggled with feeling loving toward family members who are pro-right-wing, non-inclusive politicians. I feel aversion and no desire to connect, even in the loving ways we usually connect. Would you share some wisdom on how to be a good ally in those situations and how to deal with the conflict within? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very, very frequent question in our increasingly fractious world. I think that I'm always about self-care. If we are going to practice the love and peace of spiritual allyship, we have got to protect that inner wisdom, that inner strength that we need in order to do this work. And I think we have to look differently at this moment. Never before in the history of the world has there ever been a movement that had so many people dedicated to dismantling racism in the entire world. This has never happened before. I was shocked to hear people report that this is actually bigger than the civil rights movement, because I can remember growing up just after the civil rights movement ended and thinking, gosh, I missed it. And now, or even years ago when Black Lives Matter first started, or Occupy, or Me Too, any of the things, and thinking, wow, there's this real energy, and never anticipating this moment. And so I think there's an opportunity to lean into how many like-minded people there are, and to just kind of pull back a little bit, as I like to say, from focusing on the toughest nuts to crack. It hurts. It hurts to have people whose ideas and beliefs so contradict our core values. And as we become deeper settled in those core values, we find a language to stay within our peace, and we find the best road to having impact. I also will talk in the course a little bit about stories of transformation, because I don't think we tell enough stories about people who renounced racism or white supremacy, or renounced their membership in the Ku Klux Klan and those kinds of things. I don't think we tell enough stories of those kinds of people to give us the hope that the things that we express to people around us can matter. Just because they don't matter right now doesn't mean they won't ever matter. I mean, if you think about Black Lives Matter has been going on for years, but suddenly there was this moment with George Floyd that made things different. And that's been true for every movement. There were Emmett Till's and 4 little girls and John Lewis's who there was a moment where more people got it. We're at that moment. And I think we can lean into the real joy and opportunity of that. And this just kind of pull back a little bit from the places where, we see people who aren't really working with our same set of values, just as we would in any other space. You're not going to fight against people all the time who have values. Maybe you'll fight in the policy realm, or maybe you'll work in schools so that a new generation of people comes up with different ideas. Maybe you'll go into spiritual communities where you can say to people, hey, this needs to be a part of what we practice as a spiritual community. I like to say, if you're evolved, then you're involved. And so we'll talk more about that.
Thank you so much. I want to say words, but there isn't enough time to say everything that I want to express. It's always a pleasure to get to spend time with you and to get to hear your wisdom and what you have to share. So thank you. This has been a wonderful hour with you. And thank you to everyone for being with us. Dereca, again, for sharing your wisdom and teachings with everyone on the call today. Spiritual Allyship starts Thursday, August 27th. Again, visit spiritualallyship.com to learn more or to register. And Dereca, do you have any final words for our listeners today?
Oh, well, first off, I want to say thank you to you, Nadira. It's always been so wonderful to work and build with you. And you are certainly a person who inspires me as well. And that's sort of what I love about this work is we meet people along the way in our journey. And I'm looking forward to meeting all of you and any of you who decide this is the right time and the right place and the right path. And so I'm so excited. This is my first time doing a live course on this subject. And I've been teaching on it for so very long. And I'm excited for who shows up and what we can create together. Thank you so much for your questions and for your patience and your openness to my answers, knowing that none of them have to be the right ones. They're just where we are at this moment. And let's create new moments and see what else we come up with.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on the call. We look forward to seeing you on this course or another one. On behalf of all of us at the Shift Network, I wish you well. Have a beautiful day.